Hello, Houston. Last time we kind of stumbled off coughing, hacking into the darkness with a scratchy throat, so I apologize for that. There was one thing I meant to present to you. I missed one of my pages of notes, and I wanted to go over one other fascinating demonstration of gender differences that can, in fact, be demonstrated, and raises a kind of an interesting argument. That is that the idea of cognitive gender differences do seem to be declining, noting that the occurrence is a strong argument in favor of social explanations for many of the phenomena that we look at. And one of the differences that I wanted to point out to you is something that you may or may not have observed previously, but it's summarized in this graph. And that is essentially, if we look at when you have a female speaker, who is more likely to interrupt? Okay, a female, on average, will tend to interrupt in that frequency. On the other hand, a male will tend to interrupt with that frequency. And it turns out, if we look at a male speaker, you get the same basic effect. We males are just fundamentally impolite in conversation. And the idea is that if you look at male versus female interruptions of an ongoing conversation, the male is much more likely to be the initiator of such interruptions when they actually occur. That is one fundamental, very easily demonstrable difference in the two genders as we deal with the world. And so then what we're going to do is to look into continuing or finishing our discussion of gender development, and I want to do so by hitting you with a number of different definitions. So we're going to burden you with some terms here so that we'll kind of know what we're talking about. And basically what I'm going to be doing is to define, first of all, gender typing. What I mean by that is essentially the acquisition of preferences, skills, personality attributes, behaviors, and self-concepts, which are generally considered, we could even say, socially appropriate for one's sex. That's basically what we're talking about in that case. The question then is, how do we explain that? And that puts us into an analysis of something like sociobiology. The argument there is that those genes that bestow attributes that increase our chances of survival to produce successful offspring are most likely to be transmitted to those offspring. That is, the behaviors that you and I exhibit, it is argued, which are adaptive, that lead to successful mating and the production of kids who survive, involves a set of attributes that may in fact be passed on, or more likely to be passed on, so that we really possess the genetic remains of successful adaptive strategies from our ancestors, those that have gone before us. These influence not only our anatomy, but also, it's argued, even our behavior. Traditionally, of course, men are viewed to be hunters and warriors. That has been the traditional role for males. Women, on the other hand, are caregivers, not on the other hand, by contrast, are caregivers, gatherers of fruit and vegetables, and the attributes that are bequeathed to us, attributes in both cases that are bequeathed to us, it is argued, in our genes. This would account, for instance, for factors like the upper body strength, particularly of men, and the visual and motor skills as valuable aids in hunting and war, both being traditionally male-associated activities. Empathy and nurturance, for instance, of women, in responding to, allows them to respond to children's needs as they're expressed, to be sensitive to them when they're expressed, and to enhance the youngster's likelihood of succeeding, surviving, moving on to the next generation. Prehistorically, then, it's argued that women tended to stay close to home, and there are a variety of different evidences of that from cave activity and cave dwellings and so forth and so on. Men tend to range more widely. Their remains tend to be found further out from what were the obvious central campsites and so forth. It's very controversial, in that what it really amounts to is attributing complex social behaviors such as aggression and gender roles to heredity. Critics would argue that biology is not destiny, one point. Another would be that behavior is not necessarily dictated by genes, simply as a counter occurrence, counter statement. And in essence, what we might notice is that particularly if you look in the last 3 or 4 decades of human development, there has been a strong move in this country toward equality of sex roles. There's been a conscious effort to move from woman always being at home, man always being out earning a living, to a much more equitable balance between those two roles, and therefore greater male involvement in housework chores, and so forth. It would be hard to explain that genetically, given the significance of the shift that we've had that we've experienced toward improving women's equality, strictly genetically. It didn't just happen all of a sudden in the genes. There are a number of other cross-cultural factors that we could look at here. Anthropologists, for instance, would argue that in New Guinea there exist tribes within which we can demonstrate that men are aggressive and gather food, women are idle and gabby. And yet within the same general area there are other tribes in which women are aggressive and gather food and the men are idle and gabby. So it isn't necessarily that because you're one or the other we can dictate what behaviors you're in fact going to exhibit in that situation. In some societies, also in the general area of New Guinea, there are vicious onslaughts of large groups on other large groups, and what that has done over the years is to lead to the development of defense systems that often involve training particularly boys to fight, using the upper body strength as a defensive device for the entire society. Other societies lived in much smaller groups and generally tended to be much further apart, the result being that there was not so much head-to-head confrontation a la battle or takeover kind of goals in mind there. And the net result is that the roles, one being gatherer, one being hunter, are much more evenly divided, much less clearly distinct based on the sex that's actually involved. The diversity is very hard to explain. That is, the diversity of the different social approaches that I've been describing there are in relatively close physical location to one another. It's very hard to explain that genetically. If we go to the other extreme, we could look at things like psychoanalytic theory and how it might explain it. In our society, for instance, children are aware of sex roles as early as 2.5 to 3.5 years of age. They already know what's, quotes, appropriate for a boy versus a girl. By that age, they know who cries, who hits, who does dishes, who helps dad, and a wide variety of characteristics that distinguish men and women in our society. When does gender typing actually occur in Freudian theory? It would be during the third stage of personal development. Can you name it right offhand? What is the third stage in Freud's theory? Well, it's the phallic stage. And in essence, the key elements that we're talking about there are resolution of what he identifies as the key pleasure source, and that is the genitalia. But within that, the phallic stage runs roughly ages 3 to 5, 3 to 6 perhaps, and the two things I'm reaching, there's the slide that I'm after. A key event that has to take place during those ages, according to Freud, is a resolution of the Oedipus complex for boys, and the contrast, the complement for girls, and that is the Electra complex. One example of the relatively sexist nature of Freud's theory is the fact that the Electra complex, which is intellectually the exact parallel in the opposite sex individual to the Oedipus complex for boys, was not proposed, developed, and scoped out for fully 20 years after the Oedipus complex had been developed. And it was pressure from colleagues like Jung and Adler that really forced Freud to eventually acknowledge and get into that. But in essence, what we have to do is forego incestuous urges. That's basically what's going on, whether male or female. The idea being, as you may remember, that in any of those complexes, whether you're male or female, what develops within you, theoretically, according to psychoanalysis, is a lusty urge to mate with the parent of the opposite sex. And you develop yourself into a position where you view the same-sexed parent as a competitor for the affection of the opposite sex parent. And ultimately, resolution of that is a resolution of the Electra and Oedipus complex. Let's look at another one, another explanation, and that is social learning theory. The key process here is observational learning, where in fact you're identifying with particular roles and you're being socialized by parents and the environment in which you find yourself, including school. The key element that's involved there, of course, is observational learning. 8 and 9-year-olds in one study watched adult role models state arbitrary preferences. For instance, members of one sex would vocalize a keen preference for a toy cow versus a toy horse, which was checked or stated as an object of desire by members of the opposite sex. And in other cases, the differences between oranges and apples. One sex would pick one fruit, another one would pick the other, and express their keen interest in that. And when it was their turn, boys in this particular study, 8 and 9-year-olds, agreed with the male choice 14 out of 16 times. That is 14 among 16 kids faced with playing with either a toy cow or a toy horse, chose the one that had been introduced or espoused by the same-sexed adult who'd been modeling for them. Girls selected the male item only 3 out of 16 times in the preferences that were stated there. Identification is in some ways what we're dealing with in that case. It's more than just imitation. The child basically tried to repeat behaviors of the adult models, but tries to become like the model in much broader terms. Socialization is basically what we're leading up to there. It's endemic in our society. Girls, for instance, are talked to more. Boys, on the other hand, are roughhoused with more. So there's a fundamental difference in which boys and girls are dealt with when they're kids in a family, or when they interact with Uncle Matt or Aunt Jean, whoever it happens to be that's interacting with them. Boys and girls are reinforced for gender-appropriate behaviors, not reinforced, or in fact maybe actively punished for gender-inappropriate behaviors, as judged by the older people in the environment. Mothers endorse gender role expectations, but fathers, interestingly enough, seem to be involved in communicating those expectations to the children. Maccabee and Jacqueline had a rather nice summary of this. They say specifically, and I'm quoting here from a 1974 book of theirs, which has never been summarized better. What they say is basically, aggression in general is less acceptable in girls and is more actively discouraged in them by either direct punishments, withdrawal of affection, or simply cognitive training that this isn't the way girls act. Girls then build up greater anxieties about aggression and greater inhibitions against displaying it. It's essentially an environmental effect, as being explained here. Rewards, punishments, and modeling clearly influence and foster gender-typed behaviors. It's just endemic in our social upbringing processes. So how do children integrate gender role expectations within their self-concept? This can lead to some interesting conflicts, but on the other hand, some predictable sequences in our behavior also. How do their concepts concerning gender influence their development of gender-typed behavior? Well, the answers for that can be drawn out of at least 2 different theories, one of which is cognitive developmental theory. I looked several sources and I could not, it seems to me that really ought to be cognitive development theory. But in one source it was cognitive developmental theory, and I could not find it used elsewise in other sources. So I'm going to stick with the seemingly awkward word phrase, cognitive developmental theory. But Lawrence Kohlberg was a big figure in this. He basically proposed that gender typing is not the product of environmental influences mechanically stamped in gender-appropriate behaviors. Let me say that again, because that's a lot of words. But what I'm saying is that Lawrence Kohlberg proposed, in terms of cognitive developmental theory, that gender typing is not the product of environmental influences mechanically stamping in gender-appropriate behaviors. Rather, children form concepts or schema to which they conform their behaviors, which leads in turn to another theoretical explanation, and that is what's sometimes called gender schema theory. In this case, obviously, we need to know what we're talking about by way of schema, and we define that simply as a concept. Or we can define it as a way of interpreting experience, I should say, or a way of processing information. All of those would be consistent internally consistent ways to define the word schema as it's being used by Kohlberg and those in a cognitive developmental frame of reference here. Okay, so gender typing, according to these theories, would involve the establishment of 3 different types of concepts. I told you it was going to be a little definition heavy at the beginning here. One of them is the idea of gender identity. It's acquired in most youngsters by age 3 or 4. You ask them, they know whether they're a boy or a girl. A second one is gender stability. And that's a phenomenon you can kind of predict where this is headed, but it's a concept that people retain their genders pretty much throughout their lives. That is, once you become in your own head, male or female, that tends to be a very stable feature of you and I, hence labeled gender stability. It's usually well established by age 4 or 5. You know who you are for sure. By that age, you're resistant to being dragged into the restroom for the opposite sex, and so forth and so on. A lot of different ways in which it shows up in kids' behavior. That in turn leads to yet another concept, and that is what's called gender constancy. And we define that essentially as concepts that people's genders do not change, even if they alter what they're wearing or how they behave. Okay? So gender constancy is a concept that people's genders do not tend to change, even if they alter what they're wearing or how they're actually behaving. This is normally stable, demonstrable, by age 7 or 8. So it's a slow, steady process in being involved in family life, events related to our society, and social upbringing, I should say. And it has a certain predictable sequence of events that it goes through. Once the last two develop, the stability and the constancy, children are motivated to behave appropriately for their gender. Act like a boy, act like a girl. They will show a preference for gender-appropriate behaviors once they've mastered these 3 concepts. Okay? And that in turn leads to the last one I'm going to saddle you with here right away, and that is the idea of gender schema. A gender schema is essentially a cluster of mental representations about male and female physical qualities, behaviors, and personality traits. Note, in fact, the similarity. If you'll flip back in your notes, what I'm doing is simply refining the definition that we gave of schema a little bit earlier, tying it specifically to gender in this case. But there is you'll see a strong similarity between what I was defining earlier in terms of schema and this definition of gender schema. The gender schema organizes children's perceptions of their world, basically. Such schema are emphasized by society. We understand them generally, what little boys and little girls are, quotes, supposed to do. Children adopt them very easily, very comfortably. They start organizing people along the relevant dimensions. Who's a relative, who's not a relative, among those who are not relatives, who's a friend, who's not a friend, who's a boy, who's a girl, and so forth. They learn which dimensions are important. One of the things that's, there is an old classic measurement technique called the Osgood's semantic differential, which has been used in this area in some rather interesting ways. And one of the things they find is that dimensions that tend to separate men and women include ones like strong, weak. If you're familiar with that measurement system, you know that what it normally involves is what are called bipolar opposites, bipolar adjectives. So strong, weak would be one example. Strong separated by 7 rating positions and weak at the other end. Interestingly enough, the strong, weak dimension, as but one I could mention, tends to apply more generally in the male dimension rather than in the female dimension. That one feature tends to be related specifically to male schema more so than female schema. Gender schemas also get folded into the self-concept, as we were talking about that several lectures ago. And to the extent that a kid fits appropriate schema for his or her own sex, the self-concept is greater, is more solidly planted in such a youngster. Such schema come to drive reactions that children will exhibit. Boys on a strong, weak scale tend to favor strong as their favorite word. I want to be at that end of a scale. You know, yeah, there may be 7 grades, but no, I'm over on the strong end. Girls, on the other hand, with something like a scale like, they're not so concerned about where they are on the strong-weak dimension. They are more concerned with ratings like kindness, cruelty, as the bipolar adjectives in that scale. Even information processing is influenced by gender schema, and it's amazing how subtle but total this gender schema thing gets into kids' heads. Boys, for instance, will remember male toys more easily if they're shown, if males and females, boys and girls, are shown a random collection of boys and girls' toys. When asked to list them later, the boys will tend to have a longer list. They tend to remember male toys, even when all of them were exposed equally and not particularly deferentially rank ordered as one being more powerful or anything like that. For girls, it's the female toys that they tend to remember when shown a mixture. Both have greater difficulty recalling gender inconsistent behavior a week after seeing scenes of gender appropriate and gender inappropriate behavior. I've added another look at what we're talking about there, but what I'm saying is that in addition to the differences in toys, even watching a boy do something that would typically be associated with girls tends to be remembered by everyone over a longer period than gender appropriate behaviors modeled at any given time. In other words, such schemas are very stable when we talk about gender schema. So parents have trouble accepting, for instance, boys wearing long hair. That doesn't tend to happen very often unless you've got a really independent-minded set of parents who will let their boys' hair get down to shoulder length or down on the back somewhere, something like that. You think about the kids you see at the mall, and you don't very often see a boy walking around at age 5 with a ponytail. It just doesn't happen. There are a lot of different factors that go into shaping gender typing. We've covered a wide variety of explanatory theories about gender typing, but let's go back and look at it in a different cut. What are the factors that directly influence and shape gender typing? Well, those turn out to fall into several easily clustered categories that you will recognize. One of these is our family, okay? It has its primary effect before the school years. The family is the most powerful source of influence on growing kids up until they reach the point when they enter school. Once you enter school, a lot of things change, okay? You will remember that we noted earlier that parents interact differently with boys and girls. Activities that are specialized by gender within the family would include things like the fact that boys tend to be involved and engaged in more roughhousing. More toys are bought for boys. If you look at the average array of Christmas gifts, once everything's been destroyed under the Christmas tree, not destroyed, opened under the Christmas tree, what you find is that the toys for boys typically are bought along themes of control, even extra house activities, that is, they are urged out of the family into the general environment earlier, and they're given assignments that have a kind of a control feature to them more so than girls do. Girls, on the other hand, are more likely to be given body beautiful products, whether it's lipstick or rouge or various things that are involved in makeup and so forth. They tend to be involved in toys and skills that foster the development of social skills. They are also given more extensive training in the family in household chores like kitchen-related things, cooking and so forth, and also bathroom-related chores. An attempt to hold off the scratchy throat phenomenon. It's fascinating that even the types of conversations that kids are involved in by their parents differ as a function of their sex. In one case, there was a study conducted of mothers interacting for 30 or 40 minutes with a 2.5 to 3-year-old children. In a lab situation, mom and children or child were brought into the lab situation and just allowed to interact for 30 or 40 minutes on whatever mom was concerned about that particular day. What they found was that during that interval, 23% of the mothers at some point either mentioned or expressed anger at a boy, a male child. No one among that list of women, mothers, mentioned being angry at the girl at any particular time. So in the entire group, anger was simply not mentioned when dealing with girls. Let me point out that that also, I'm not going to talk about it directly, but one of the other reasons that that probably happens is that if you think about it, you are more likely to see a boy disciplined at a mall than a girl. In general, it is the tradition that girls, yeah, they have to be corrected just like boys, but parents tend to do that more often in the privacy of the family car or something like that. They're less likely to be public in their correction of a girl, a young girl, still under family control. There are all sorts of reactions to gender inappropriate behaviors if you think about them. The sissy label is readily applied to boys doing, quotes, inappropriate things, okay? Playing with a sister or with girls and a set of dolls would tend to get a boy labeled as a sissy. It's interesting that a label like tomboy, which might normally be attached to women, girls, who are engaged in gender inappropriate or traditionally thought of as inappropriate behaviors, do not have that label as intensely applied to them. That is the cross-sex situation. Sissy may be applied. Tomboy you don't tend to hear very often, and girls more often wear tomboy as a label of pride if they do happen to get tagged that way as they're growing up. Clothing is another example of the ways in which our society just constantly impresses the difference between men and women. One designer several years ago offered a set of women's undergarments mimicking men's t-shirts and jockey briefs. Okay, that is, it was offered to women. And it essentially, it was an imprinted version of jockey shorts and the kind of t-shirts that men will tend to wear as undershirts. Is anyone aware of a designer that has offered pink-laced bikinis as a potential underwear for sale to men? You just don't see that. I mean, the only one I could think of was Fredericks of Hollywood. You never quite know what Fredericks of Hollywood is going to offer, but that kind of in my entire weathered history, I can't think of a single instance where I saw pink lacy underwear available for men in the men's store. It just doesn't happen. So both parents really attach such messages, but males are more likely to target and to be the target of messages regarding gender inappropriate behavior. There's another factor that jumps in here, and that is aggression. Okay, allegedly parents tend to discourage aggression in daughters, but ignore or actually encourage it in sons. You have to be brave, you have to go out and face that bully, you need to handle him. More likely to be told to a boy than a girl in family situation. You think that. Not so. It turns out that generally parents are not more permissive of aggression than in sons than in daughters. They do not encourage aggression as a function of sex. In situations where it is required, whether it's a male or a female, they will encourage, they stand up for your rights. But it's not differentially visited on little boys more so than little girls. How it is learned is the fact that, for instance, males are just more aggressive physically. They tend to just function that way as a sex. It may be that modeling is involved. If you think about the typical home situation, for instance, dad is the one who normally decides I hate to say this, but it's true, is more likely to decide what's watched on television. If you think about it, think back to your own home environment, and I'll bet you your dad is the one that normally selects what the family is going to watch when it's a family television opportunity. Okay? I had, as a very interesting example of roles and how we often tend to slip into them, I had a class. No wonder there was a disjuncture here. Oh, there we are. I was jumping into something I wasn't ready to talk about yet, so give me just a second, get organized here. The notes got out of order. He tends to be the ultimate authority in terms of making decisions, what car we're going to buy, whether we're going to put it on a finance plan, and so forth and so on. In fact, a father is more likely to use physical intimidation to get his way, if you think about it. Children see repeatedly that aggression is a male thing. It's not a female thing. It doesn't tend to be modeled as often by mom. Another factor is independence. There's mixed evidence on that, but in general, boys are encouraged to play alone earlier than girls are. If you think about things like Little League, the boy is more likely to be put on a bike and sent off to the field alone than would be a sister at the same age. They're left alone earlier in the house when mom has to go out, as happens to all of us occasionally. Both parents have to be away. The boy tends to be trusted in the home or simply left in the home earlier than the girl does. But except for special situations, parents are no more likely to offer help to guys than to girls. That is, when a child is in an elementary learning situation where they're having trouble with a homework assignment or something like that, parents are no more likely to offer help to boys than to girls in that situation. So if we summarize it, for both aggression and independence, there's a mixed but minimal evidence of different treatment by parents as a boy versus as a girl, or of a boy versus a girl child. The popular media are simply wrong in the extent to which parents are credited for differential treatment of boys and girls. They do not tend to do, we parents do not tend to do that, okay? So there must be other factors that we can credit for the difference that is very clearly there among little boys versus little girls. One of those is peers, okay? And I'm defining peers as essentially other children of approximately the same age as the child about whom we're talking at any given time. The best intentioned parents raising unisex children, treating their boy or girl identically, are fine until Junior or Missy enters kindergarten. And if the boy, if the girl, Tina May, arrives in army boots for elementary school, she's going to be harassed. If Randolph happens to arrive carrying a Cabbage Patch doll, his favorite, under an arm, it's fine, but he's going to be greeted with considerable negative emotion by his peers, both boys and girls. It's not right for a boy to be carrying a Cabbage Patch doll in the minds of the children. So the effects are basically registered in at least 3 different ways by those peers. One of them is to talk about what's called gender segregation. And there you have a set of rules that are so subtle but so carefully utilized that we don't tend to think about it a lot. Years ago, I taught a class in summer school called the University Experience. It was a class that our faculty, in fact the legislature in its infinite wisdom, did not decide to ultimately underwrite. I've always thought it was a good idea, but it was the University Experience was envisioned when it was originally proposed as a kind of an owner's guide, an operator's manual for students. Undergraduates. It was targeted specifically at teaching undergraduates how to maximize the value of their education, when to stand up and argue with somebody, when to seek help, and so just a whole array of things, everything from career testing and the importance of doing it if you don't quite know where you're headed, more so as you get to be a sophomore, junior, senior. Let me not get off subject here, but in any case, it was an interesting class, and one of the things I liked about it was that we really tried to put faculty and students on the same level. So in the rooms where it was taught, enrollment was limited to 30, no more, and the chairs were put in a circle. The idea being nobody was bigger or better than anybody else, and it was simply in a group, so everybody looked at everybody. And the advantage, of course, in a circle is that you don't have people in the back that you can't quite hear, and people in the back can hear people in the front when you're in the form of a circle. But I was stunned by the fact that we met in a room of movable chairs that summer, and automatically, when class was over, we left the chairs. I'm just classic bad manners, but we just left the chairs where we'd use them, and every single time when the next class came in, without a word being spoken, they put the chairs back very precisely in a square, 5 across, 6 deep. I never heard a word uttered. It just happened. The chairs started moving as soon as the next class came in. And that's kind of the subtlety level at which we parents tend to raise our children. There are many things that happen we just don't even think about. That's Junior's activity, that's Missy's activity, and so forth and so on. The rules by which we operate are amazingly subtle but clear in terms of the effect. Children, for instance, classify other children by gender schema. Okay, because adults do. They occupy different intellectual social worlds with little communication across the gap. By 4th grade, teachers will concede that one fourth grade teacher described a class in which no activities were organized by sex. She deliberately did not offer any activity by sex, and yet spontaneously, when games were proposed, a boys' side and a girls' side always developed. It was simply boys against girls as a dividing characteristic, even though at no time had the sex of any given student been featured in terms of you there, and so forth. Separate lines to go to other activities are often the case. The boys line up, the girls line up. And it's again just kind of the inbuiltness of the stability of these kind of effects in the environment that we bring our kids up in. If you look at it at recess, the girls will tend to go play easier games like hide and seek, gentler games like hide and seek. The boys are out playing soccer, okay, when left to their own devices. So there are a lot of different things that crop up in the schooling system as we operate it. And that in turn leads to another concept I wanted to introduce, and that is what's called gender prejudice, okay? An 8-year-old, classy experiment that was done here. One reason I wanted to cite specifically gender prejudice here, but a really clever experiment was done in which an 8-year-old girl, not yet old enough to be a girl or a boy, was dressed in gender-neutral clothing, okay? And then she was filmed performing one of 12 different tasks. 4 of them were judged typical of boys, things like football as one example. She was shown engaged in a game of football. 4 of them were activities that were judged typical of girls, things like, for instance, jumping rope, a classic female sport in elementary school. And 4 of them were judged as neutral, the kind of things a boy or a girl might do. Bike riding is but one example. So the typical tasks were as extreme male-oriented as football, jumping rope, or bike riding. So you had male, female, and theoretically neutral sports being involved there. The films were played for 1st, 3rd, and 5th graders. Okay, groups of 1st, 3rd, and 5th graders. They were shown the films and they were asked to rate 1 to 4 the quality of the performance of the star of the film, who was never introduced as either a boy or a girl, simply a person. Was the way in which it was gender neutral as the film was used. And when they were introducing differences, I misspoke. What they did do was to use a specific name in introducing the child. It was not gender neutral. I stand corrected. The kid in the film was labeled as either Anne or John, with no particular reference to that. It was simply, we're going to watch a movie of Anne, playing football, doing whatever was involved in the movies. The 12 movies that were created, and there was the one name difference was introduced in the course of giving the instructions. What was found was that the girls rated the child much higher when they thought she was a girl. She was simply rated higher when in any of the activities in which she was engaged when they thought she was a girl than when they thought she was a boy. So sex was important even to the 8-year-olds in doing this rating. Boys tended to rate the child much higher when they thought she was a boy than when they thought she was a girl in these particular activities. That is, each gender favored their own gender very specifically, very cleanly. Okay? And I thought I had a graph for that. I guess I don't. It was so graphically obvious I didn't even have to diagram it. But it was interesting that as you went from 1st to 3rd to 5th grade students looking at the films and rating them, as the grade level went up, the difference when rating the same sex versus an opposite sex actor or actress went up, increased. That is, as you move from 1st to 3rd to 5th grade raters in that situation, the differences between boys rating boys versus boys rating girls and girls rating boys versus girls rating girls increased in that situation. There was a more pronounced bias at the higher grades, and the nature of the task, whether performed by a male, a female, or neutral, did not matter in that situation. The nature of the task itself simply had no impact on the ratings themselves. That is, an act of the same gender is best regardless of what they are doing. Boys tend to favor boys, girls tend to favor girls when acting on rating a youngster demonstrating any of the different 12 tasks that they demonstrated. that they viewed. That's the word I'm looking for. I'll get the right word out. And then we can look at differential treatment. Okay? In that case, whoops, I've jumped ahead of what I meant to be on here. Hope I can get to where I want to be there. Differential treatment again. Let's observe 2.5 to 5.5-year-old preschoolers. 5 minutes a day on different days. That was another way to look at what I'm talking about here. And what was found that the question that was being asked was essentially, was the behavior that was being targeted at a child positive or negative? Examples of positive behavior targeted at a child would be things like patting or helping or praising a youngster doing anything in the schoolroom situation. And negative activities would be things like hitting, pushing, or kicking. Those would be the kind of things that were rated in negative in that rating viewing situation. Rated attractiveness of the youngsters was very positively correlated with pro-social actions targeted at girls. Okay? It was about a 0.73 positive correlation between how attractive the girl was viewed to be when the activities that were targeted at her were positive. Okay? It was not related to pro-social actions that were targeted at the boys. Now I'm raising there, you have to think about what I've just told you there a minute, because it's really a very complex kind of twist that I put on everything we've been talking about so far. But what's essentially being demonstrated there is that when positive versus negative activities or behaviors are targeted at girls, it tends to relate very positively to the way in which the girl is rated in terms of overall attractiveness. And I don't mean that physically, but simply togetherness, if you want to use that as a word in the situation. How effective she is in the environment that you find herself in. It had no correlation at all, whether positive or negative effects being targeted at boys in that kind of situation. And a similar pattern also emerged for physical aggression when it was targeted at boys as opposed to at girls. So another factor then that you saw me sneak ahead to there a minute ago that we need to look at is the effect of school. Though more time is spent with families, even during school years, the amazing thing is that the schools become the primary source of gender-specific behaviors. So even when you're in school, you're there only, what, 6 hours a day, maybe 9 to 3, 9 to 4, so 7 hours a day at the extreme. The other 18 or 17 hours, depending on the length of your school, is with the family, or getting to the family, or interactions controlled by the family. And yet, despite that, once we enter school, once we enter elementary school, the structure and so forth of that school does impact our behavior more so than does the family life itself. School, once it occurs, becomes the all-powerful source of influence. Sex role stereotyping occurs, for instance, in the observant eyes of children, even in the faculty. Think back to the school that you grew up in, and I'll bet you that the elementary school teachers you had were exclusively, if not predominantly, female. Okay? I would argue, for instance, that in high school, they may be male or female. You're more likely to run into men in teaching positions in high school than in elementary school. But if you think about it, I'll bet you science and math teachers were men. On the other hand, English and foreign language teachers were women. So there is a division among sexes that still occurs even when we get into high school. So that sexism in some ways is bred into our children simply by the people that we select to educate them in a given situation. I'll pose another problem to you. I'll bet you, many to one, I'll bet lunch money, that the principal of your school was a male. Simply based on the idea that if you look at school administrators generally, less than 15% tend to be female. That's gradually changing in recent years. There's some evidence that it's beginning to balance out more. But the high prestige positions in general, whether in discipline or in administrative position, tend to be associated with the males. The lower prestige positions, whether in terms of administration or teaching area, tend to be associated with the females. If you look at teachers' behavior, that's another way in which to look at it, and that is the fact that boys tend to receive more attention in the school environment. This is amazing, but it's been demonstrated many times in a variety of different studies. Males tend to get more positive attention. They get more feedback. Their creativity is recognized more publicly, more consistently. They tend to be called on in class. I was horrified when I had somebody come in and watch me teach about 30 years ago when I was still an assistant, perhaps an associate professor. But out of curiosity, I had an expert in teaching come in and just watch me teach so he could critique what I was doing. And the number one thing that just hit me between the eyes was that when I asked a question, what I tended to do was call on males. I was totally unaware of the fact that I was doing that, but I was, and therefore consciously now it turns out that, and this is kind of, behind the scenes information that I'm giving you here, but in general what happens in a college classroom is males tend to respond, and I said tend, not always, and it's changing, but they tend to respond more rapidly. And so if you're in a situation where I am, where I'm lecturing 500 people at a time, I don't like to waste time. There's a lot to cover. And so I get a response, I call on it. At least that used to be the way I looked at it. And now I will consciously wait an extra several seconds before I select somebody to answer the question. And I do now consciously try to balance it off, men and women, in the selection of what we're talking about. But there are just many ways in which behaviors that teachers may not even be aware of kind of creep into and impact the elementary school, high school, and even the college classroom. Males receive also more negative attention. They get more frequent scoldings and public scoldings. Females tend to get less frequent scoldings, and it tends more often to be done in private. So whether behaving properly or improperly, boys simply do tend to receive more attention. And if you ask teachers what they think about what they're doing in their off time, it turns out that males not only seem to be more valued in the school, more focused on in the school, but they're even thought about after school by teachers more often than are comparable females in a given situation. And whether intentionally or not, boys then just become more highly visible in the cognitive activities of the teacher. And the way in which you conduct the teaching, kind of like the example I was giving a minute ago of my own screw-ups, is the fact that if you introduce a toy into an elementary school classroom, if the toy is introduced with a boy showing how it's operating, okay, you instruct the youngster beforehand so that he's the one who's called on to, John, why don't you show us how the dump truck works and how you can make it go forward and dump and so forth and so on. What happens is that if they include comments like Dad is going to work driving a truck in the example that they've created in their own head in demonstrating it, at recess, once the toy becomes accessible, boys are much more likely to head toward it than are girls. But on the other hand, if the truck is introduced gender neutral, no specific boy doing it particularly, or focusing on my dad, a boy speaking, my dad drives a truck to work or anything like that, then you have equal numbers of both boys and girls in elementary school who will approach the truck and play with it during the recess period when they gain access to it. So the very structure of the classroom itself becomes a force leading toward the particular gender behaviors that we tend to encourage in our children, sometimes quite unintentionally. So in essence then, one of the ways in which we can encourage change, I was afraid I might have gotten behind here, in which we can encourage change was illustrated, for instance, by a 6-week program that was implemented in one school where essentially there was non-sexist role-playing that was engaged in very consistently as classroom activity. And in fact, they studied, for instance, stereotypical advertising as an example to highlight the importance of paying attention to what you're being blasted with through the TV speaker or the radio or anything else. And another of the activities they were engaged in was learning about famous women in our society. And the results were that at all grades, it's interesting, at all grades, the girls were more open to change than were the boys. The girls were more open to change. In kindergarten, there was some positive change that was manifested among all the youngsters who were studied, the girls being more open to change. At 5th grade, there was very little evidence of change. And at the 9th grade, the students were actually more sexist in their orientation after the 5 weeks of non-sexist role-playing that had been engaged in. So we do need, whether it is ultimately a solution that is achievable through the schools is hard to say, but we do need to be sensitive to the existence of sexism in the examples we choose, in the literature that we encourage people to read, and so forth. There's a lot of work to neutralizing the school system that we currently offer by way of a standard education. There's some other things we can look at, and these are almost too easy to pick out, but one of the things that we use by way of media are books. And in one study done in the mid-1970s, less than half of the actual population at that time, because of the cumulative effects of war, was male. And yet in the texts that were analyzed at that point, mid-70s, over 70% of the main characters were male. So it's an endemic kind of problem, in essence. Generally, males were depicted as industrious, clever, and brave. Well, we know that's right, of course. But on the other hand, the females were depicted as passive, dependent, and kind. Why they're drummed into that role and why kindness is the result or the associated theoretical result, I'm not quite sure. But it turns out to be, it's a worldwide problem. In English, I can point out to you, it's probably been pointed out to you before, but the gender neutral pronoun that English requires is he. If you're making a statement that has where sex is irrelevant in terms of what you're talking about, you talk about he or him. And it's specifically determined when that is, when the sex of the character is not specifically determined, the language normally requires that you use the male pronouns. And the result is that the female, in that case, simply by language becomes more invisible. If you read a story to preschool boys and girls of one of three forms, you get a rather interesting effect. It's going to be a story that involves stereotypic achievement by boys, not by a girl. In the other case, you're going to be sharing with the students a reversal story that shows achievement by a girl, not by a boy, in the story, or a neutral story about non-achieving animals, okay, completely off the scale in terms of boy versus girl. Having read that, having listened to that, the children were then introduced in, and I'm sure you've all faced this at one time or another, somebody sends you a bouquet of flowers with about that many stems in it, and the vase is about half the size, and you're trying to jam all the flowers in and not crush them. A typical problem that any of us might face, whether man or woman. And essentially what they were given was a flower stuffing activity into a vase where the stuffing was not necessarily easy. I mean, it was some bit of a challenge. And what they found was that how the children acted was very much a function of the storybook condition about which they had been reading. So if you look just at boys, what you find is that the likelihood of persisting in the flower stuffing task, which was deliberately tough, I mean, it was going to be tough to treat the flowers gently and get them in where they were intended and so forth. But if they had followed a story about an achieving boy, they would persist in the task 2.5 to 3 times as long as if they had read a story about a persisting or an achieving girl. And yet, on the other hand, for girls, it was more balanced, but there was still that distinction. That is, if girls had read a story about or participated in an activity that involved an achieving girl, when they were then faced with this challenging effect, the net result was that the girls persisted longer when they had been engaged in an activity that involved girls achieving in a particular situation. And so what you see here is that achieving girls, or I should say girls, follow the model of an achieving girl. It is clear that education offers us a route out of this dilemma that our society has created for ourselves, in the same way that boys tend to be educable by achieving boys. But maybe that suggests that one counter effect would be to, first of all, involve more girls in the kind of stories that we're studying, and perhaps reduce the number of instances where we're seeing males achieving in any given situation from flowers on upward in this situation. Another factor that we can look at, and this one is almost too easy to talk about, television. Okay, a scary statistic about television. I saw this several years ago, and it has just hung with me. It goes all the way back to President Reagan, but he commissioned a presidential commission on the effects of television. And one of the things that that group reported, this is now 25, 30 years ago, essentially, that when you look at the average person who graduates high school, they have spent more time watching television than they have in the schoolroom since they entered the school system. Whether they start in preschool, pre-kindergarten, or kindergarten, first grade even, if that's when the society requires it, that particular state requires it. The fact is that you can summarize the hours in the classroom for any of those, and we spend more time as a society, our children, more time in front of the television than we have in the schoolroom being educated by this society. And the net result is that if you look at the content of what we're watching, that's in some ways even more scary. Males are represented much more frequently than females. First of all, I think I challenged you once before, but think about how many programs you can mention on the standard Monday to Friday night fare that have a female star as opposed to a male. Really, the first one that went that direction was Angela Lansbury's Murder, She Wrote. That was really the first major nationally distributed and very popular television show that involved a female star rather than a male, and nobody mentioned it at the time. But if you think, the impact enduring has been relatively small. The fact that she broke that barrier. Males are stereotypically much more likely to be shown in a working position, solving their own problem. Women need help, or active, not watching what's going on. The kind of things I was identifying in the society itself tend to be reflected in the television that we also offer. There are solutions, but we need to understand the nature of the problems themselves. Men tend to be reinforced up to twice as often. They're punished 3 times as often as women. Women are basically invisible in television in some of the major forces that society works on. I mean, we dole out rewards when a job is well done. We tend to punish people, and so forth when a job is not well done. And that's overemphasized in the television shows that we tend to watch. Media plays a big and very predictable role in the society that we have around us here right now. In general, men and women are playing gender-appropriate roles, okay? Adelson in 1990 said, "Women are often still depicted on television as half-clad, half-witted, and needing to be rescued by quick-thinking, fully clothed men." And I was thinking about that when I was rereading it in my notes, and I thought about it. Think, for instance, about any of the major popular detective shows that are available right now. I'm thinking, for instance, of the series that include things like Law and Order is one of those that right now has several different forms that it's offered in. But if you look at the detectives in those things when they're in the lab, the woman is invariably in a plunging neckline blouse, okay, showing breast. The male is dressed in a business suit, typically. Okay? So we haven't gotten away from that, despite having it been pointed out to us. But if you think about it, that's sexist relative presentation. I get annoyed every time I think about it in that. But it's still with us. And you can even go to my favorite CSI. I shouldn't say that. But that gender thing that the woman is dressed for sex before competence, even though she may be the key to solving a particular case, it's a strange situation. It was broken not only by Angela Lansbury, but if you remember back, there was a classic television show called Charlie's Angels, where in fact 3 women played various roles where they were clearly the lead. But if you remember how they were dressed, if you've seen reruns of it, they were always in short shorts or in bathing suits, or something was required in their role that they be scantily clad. So yeah, they were women in accomplishing situations, but they were still dressed scantily. The salvation out of this is multifaceted, but one of the areas that it moves us into is looking at things like androgyny, which may be a kind of an extreme position to go to here. But if we define it, what we're talking about with androgyny is the coexistence of culturally stereotyped masculine and feminine thoughts, emotions, physical appearance, and other aspects of behavior and personality in one person. somebody who is androgynous will exhibit those kind of behaviors. It was a popular concept first introduced back in the 70s, but it has taken hold. There is some evidence that it remains as a popular lifestyle. And it's reflected in many different ways in everyday life. If you think about someone who works on a project building their home or something in their house on one day, and the next day is consoling a friend about illness or problems with a boyfriend or girlfriend, that's what I mean by androgynous behavior. That is, you draw from both the male contingent of things traditionally associated with us and from the female contingent about things traditionally associated with females. It seems a kind of a nice alternative to sex role stereotype models that we've seen so often here. There are traditional scales to measure these kind of things, which are the opening, the bipolar thing I was talking about before, the masculine, feminine, good, bad, active, passive, you name it. That's a very effective device for measuring the very subtle changes that sometimes occur in people's behavior as a function of whatever they've been watching. Masculinity and femininity used to describe behaviors that have traditionally been thought of to be more appropriate for females and males respectively. What is being suggested here is that there are perhaps a number of different ways in which that can be balanced out in the behavior of both men and women. And in terms of androgyny, we could talk about, for instance, undifferentiated androgyny, which basically involves people who score low on both femininity and masculinity scales. It's unusual, but it does happen. An undifferentiated androgynous person would be low feminine, low masculine. We have then, of course, feminine people. These are illustrated by oh, Pete darned. My apologies. I just got a new cell phone yesterday, and I'm sitting here with it ringing in my pocket. Sorry about that. You're just going to have to endure it a minute. I won't answer it, but I'll yell at whoever called me. I never even thought about it as I'm sitting here lecturing. Feminine people are basically people who score high on femininity, low on masculinity. These are pretty self-obvious, so I don't need to spend a whole lot of time. Those scoring mainly high on masculinity scales as opposed to femininity. And then finally, androgynous people who basically score high on both masculinity and femininity. It can be measured on a variety of scales. One of the classics that's been used a lot is the BEM sex role inventory that involves 60 items rated on a 7-point scale, from 1 meaning behaviors that are never or almost never true of a given individual, all the way to 7 where it's almost always or always true of a given individual. The items described activities and attributes generally thought to be masculine typed or feminine typed. There was another survey done in the late 70s that involved 36 items such as, it is more important for a wife to help her husband's career than to have a career herself. And what you were rating there was degree of agreement with any given statement in this particular situation. The results were complex early. What we're looking for is essentially an early word for things like egalitarian or genderless society. Androgynous people are much more flexible in terms of choosing activities, more likely to offer help to someone who's choking. Interestingly, on the beach, you know from intro that if you're choking in a situation where there are a lot of people around, you're more likely to get help than if you're sorry, it's the other way around. You're choking in a situation where there are relatively a large number of people, you are less likely to get help than if you're choking in a situation where there are relatively few people that could offer, because there's no diffusion of responsibility in that kind of a situation. Masculine people, on the other hand, are higher in mechanical reasoning and self-esteem and adjustment. Androgyny, on the other hand, is not consistently related to behavior itself. It tends to be involved in the kind of activities that someone gets into. And the results suggest essentially that androgyny offers no special advantage to someone, whether male or female, but it's based on the very concepts that it was designed to avoid, which makes it a kind of an interesting measurement technique that we end up having to face here. Changing individuals is not so important, really, as given what I've been talking about here, as changing institutions themselves. That's where the ultimate move toward a sexless society is going to move in terms of responsibility, expectations, and so forth and so on. And then let's look at a couple of alternative concepts that we can also indicate, try to squeeze this in between phone calls here. One has to do with gender role transcendence, which is a rather complex topic. Let me see if I can define it for you fairly straightforward and easily. What you're expected to do there, or what gender role transcendence involves, is moving beyond gender roles to express freely various human qualities. Okay? If you can move beyond your specific sex and gender role training, that's an example of gender role transcendence. It might involve being masculine in some situations, for instance, competitive to achieve a career goal. On the other hand, feminine in other situations, kind in interactions, and so forth. There are some others that we could suggest, one of which is blended androgyny. And what's involved there is essentially demonstrating new characteristics, neither masculine nor feminine, but better than either alone. The move here is basically beyond masculinity and femininity into a role that would typically draw more or less equally from what we expect of typical males versus what we expect of typical females. Now, lest you panic that I've run out of material again, let's suggest that what I want to do is to move ahead because of the fact that it turns out I misread my own syllabus and I'm a little bit behind where we ought to be. So I'm going to go ahead and start this section on sexuality, perhaps even ahead of when you've done the relevant reading in this material. And we're going to start again with a couple of different definitions, unfortunately. I hate to saddle you with all these words, but it's just in the nature of undergraduate education that we tend to stuff you with vocabulary words so you can talk like a physicist, a biologist, a psychologist, whatever. So we start with, some of these are going to be pretty obvious, but we start with something like sexual orientation, and we define it basically as one's erotic attraction toward and sexual interest in members of the opposite gender, in some cases, the same gender, or both genders, in terms of your sexual orientation. That in turn leads to a second term. We're just going to pile them on you here right now. That is heterosexual orientation, which is essentially an erotic attraction to and preference for developing romantic relationships with members of the opposite gender. Okay, that's the heterosexual and by far the most frequent orientation that we humans tend to exhibit. Okay, so the initial definition defined the several types that I'm going to be talking about here, but heterosexual orientation is the one that we will spend ultimately the most time with programmatically here. Then we look at thirdly, homosexual orientation, and the difference here is predictable, and that is that it's an erotic attraction to and preference for developing romantic relationships with members of one's own gender, one's own sex. Homosexual as a label applies both to males and to females. Usually, the terms that are used then are for homosexual men, you will see phrases like either gay male or gays, and for homosexual women, you will see phrases like gay women or lesbians. The terms are used differently in that sense. We have then another possibility, and that is what's called a bisexual orientation. This is somewhat unusual, but it's essentially an erotic attraction to and preference for developing romantic relationships with members of either gender, one's own or the opposite gender. We should perhaps start by correcting one source of potential confusion here, and that is that homosexuals do not wish to be members of the opposite gender. Like heterosexuals, as we'll find as we study the phenomenon, those who are homosexual have a gender identity that is consistent with their anatomic gender. Okay? Heterosexuals tend to emphasize the sexual aspects of homosexual relationships, but such relationships are not based only on sex. As with heterosexual relationships, long-term homosexual relations are based on the formation of romantic links. The relationship is a basis for loving and for sharing. So how do we then classify sexual orientation? It is going to be a problem we'll have to face, and that is having one or more sexual encounters with members of one's own sex does not automatically make one a homosexual by orientation. It can be caused by adolescent experimentation, that's one source of homosexual contact. In some cases, environmental limits. Think, for instance, about jails as but one example of that. Or even a cultural practice can potentially explain it, depending on the society that you're talking about. And we really need to distinguish between homosexual behavior as opposed to homosexual orientation. I'm going to be talking more in the area of orientation than behavior. There is a problem distinguishing between heterosexual or heteroerotic. Boy, I have trouble with this word. There's a problem distinguishing between what are called heteroerotic interests and homoerotic interests. Okay, certainly both heterosexual and homosexual individuals may have erotic interests or fantasies of either the same or the opposite gender. And homosexuality and heterosexuality may not be mutually exclusive categories of individuals, as we'll see. Okay, in fact, when we get into this, what we find is that in classifying the various types of sexual orientation, I'm going to lead into here what is called the Kinsey continuum. Related to that, I had a set of information that I think I wanted to drop in here. Give me just a second to wade through my notes. Okay, we can get into this here in a little bit. Basically, Kinsey and his colleagues developed what became known as a 7-point scale, in which what they were trying to do was to demonstrate the differentiate between heterosexual versus homosexual orientation. And it looks a lot more glamorous than it really is when we look at this, as you'll see here in just a minute. But in essence, what happened was that they developed the idea of if you were a 0 on this particular scale, you were exclusively heterosexual in the experiences that you had and wished to have. Okay? You were considered to be a 1 on this scale if you had at least some homosexual experience. Age was not specified here. 2 was more than incidental homosexual experience. You were rated a 3 on this scale if you had homosexual as much as or more than heterosexual experience. You were related as, or you were identified as a 4 if you had mostly homosexual experiences. And you were rated as a 5 if you had exclusively homosexual experiences. And you were rated as a 6 if you had exclusively homosexual experiences. I find it interesting that the traditional developers of scale would have been horrified by this. I would point out to you, for instance, that the word I was using to anchor position 2 over here on the scale, 1 left of absolute neutrality, was using phrases like more than incidental homosexual experience. And yet by the time we got to number 4, 1 position the other side of neutrality, I'm already using phrases like mostly homosexual. That is not a truly balanced scale if you think about it. You need to be careful in inserting people into this scale. How frequently are these kind of experiences encountered? In the late 70s, reports suggested that about 14% of men and 4% of women have had more than incidental homosexual behaviors, or had more than incidental homosexual behavior, meaning 5 or more partners or 21 or more incidents. That has changed rather substantially in recent time as we look at this. And I think this is the point where I want to include the data which I stumbled across that was quite interesting, and that is there was a really major study done of sex in America, one of the most fundamental and even now widespread surveys that was well done scientifically in terms of sampling. The problem up until the mid-90s was that many of the surveys that were done involved volunteers or maybe somebody's students in one university, one class, and so forth. And it really wasn't until 1994 that Robert Michael and colleagues developed a study that really involved almost 3,500 individuals who were ranged from age 18 up to age 50 across much of the sexual range of age of contact. And basically, they suggested that in summarizing their data, what they could do was to really classify Americans' involvement in sexual activity into 3 pretty definable groups. One is the group that had sex 2 times a week on average. A second who had sex, a second group, about a third of us, have sex a few times a month, and a third who have sex a few times a year or not at all. And that's a kind of a 1/3, 2/3, 3/3 division of the frequency with which we Americans participate in sex. Married couples, among all the different roles that we play in society, are the most likely to have sex, and the members participating in the act are most likely to reach orgasm among married partners. Secondly, or in addition to that, most Americans report essentially no kinky sex acts. That is, when describing what's a satisfying or typical sex act for them, most of us have no kinky sex acts in our array of activities as were surveyed by Michael. What he found was that 96% said that vaginal sex was, quotes, very or somewhat appealing. That is, it was way toward the positive end. A second finding was that the number 2 most interesting sex activity surprised me a bit as I read it. It made sense after I thought about it a bit. But the number 2 most frequently cited sex activity, you're going to not guess this, is watching your partner undress. That turns out to be the second most frequently cited favored sex activity. And the third one then is oral sex. So there is a very clear rank ordering of the likelihood of the type of sex in which we humans will engage, in which we Americans will engage. Adultery turns out to be quite rare among married partners in the U.S. 75% of married men reported that they had never been unfaithful to their partner, and 85% of the married women reported that they had never been unfaithful to their partner. So we are a relatively stable society in that respect. When asked, have you had homosexual sex in the last year, in that survey, mid-90s, 2.7% of the men indicated that they had done so, 1.3% of the women indicated that they had done so. So the traditional suggestion of a 2-to-1 ratio in favor of men more likely to have been involved in homosexual experiences does tend to be confirmed by the data gathered by Michael. But overall, summarizing this research, the key summary is essentially that marriage and monogamy are by far the most powerful, far-reaching description of most Americans involved in sexual relations. That comes most recently from a book by Santrock published in 1906, in which he was summarizing the kind of the fallout from Michael's survey conducted back in the mid-1990s. We can jump back into the data that I was just giving you, but I think it might be smoother to start our next lecture at this point. So we'll conclude on marriage and monogamy for today.